Hello, you getting your first essay this week, 2,000 words minimum, and I encourage you to read the syllabus regarding the structure of your paper in conjunction with the video that I've already put up in terms of how to do an essay. And what I will do here is to go through the first 4 chapters of Hebrews to orient you in respect to how to approach the essay that you've got in the first couple of weeks. This will help you to see the way that I would approach a paper like this so that it will give you a sort of a benchmark on how to look in respect to these papers. Now, you've already seen the sort of way that I want you to start looking at this material. Hebrews is obviously the largest book that we'll be studying, 13 chapters, and you can see I've divided it up into 3 2-week sections. So at this point, what we've got is 4 chapters, and the minutiae that I've forced you to look at is the 50 questions in which perusing them to find the answers to those questions, which are relatively easy once you get into the text and you have to look for the answers, which means that I hope by now that you're familiar with the text. And therefore, in approaching this question as you look at it, which is a fairly basic question in respect to the 4 chapters, is that what I would encourage you to do, especially if you're not familiar really with the book of Hebrews at all, is to look and read the 4 chapters, say 3 times, which won't take you very long, and look for the big picture. Don't get lost in the minutiae of it again. Look for the big picture and look for themes within the picture. In simple terms, again, and this goes back to the outline that I will mark and get back to you. Look at your outline that you've done and see how that fits in with now, because what we've done is you've given an outline of the whole book, and now you're going in just a little bit more and going to look at the outline in your mind of the first 4 chapters, because that will help you then to sort of zone in on what this essay subject matter is, and you can get an idea then of what the thematic nature of the first 4 chapters is all about. And obviously, it's about one particular figure who is brought out right at the beginning, and that is the Son. And that's carried right through the 4 chapters. And the first thing I want to say is that sometimes you may come across it, you may have done this already, is that the feature in the first 4 verses of the chapter, which is known as the prologue, or sort of before the word, in other words, the summation or the introduction of what I call it a letter, but it's not really as a letter until you really get to the end. And some commentators have thought that the material at the end, if you look at the end of the book of Hebrews in chapter 13, you can see why it's called a letter, because there you get all the personal remarks of the author to individuals, which some commentators have thought that was added later. I don't think that's the case, but it was added later to make sure that it looked like a letter, because probably one of the basic things that you saw right at the beginning is that when you look at chapter 1, it does not look like a letter at all, does it? It looks basically like an essay, and it's very well structured, very well put together in a very sophisticated form, which, as you've, I'm sure, read by now, has led to a number of people, even going back to the Reformation, people like Martin Luther, suggesting that this is not Paul who's written this. This is somebody with what I'd call a Greek turn of mind, like Apollos, who have penned this. It's very sophisticated, and you can see from the beginning that it's not, in that sense, a letter, but it's more an essay. It's very structured, and the prologue or the introduction is a sort of summation of the piece as a whole, and it will certainly help us in respect to what we're looking at. And I would suggest to you that you can see the mapping out, certainly of the first four chapters in what is the purpose of your essay, by just looking at those first four verses. The elements there are very strong in respect to the past and the present, where the interplay is that whoever the author was and whom he's writing to, whether it's predominantly Jewish Christians or a mix of Jewish and Gentile Christians, or Jewish Christians who were Hellenized. In other words, they were in the diaspora and were Hellenized from the standpoint of their culture and their upbringing as Jews, and were therefore familiar with the Hellenized culture and thought in a Greek frame of mind, but were Jewish in their education. Then you can see from that standpoint that the author appealed to them in a particular way using Jewish and Greek categories, as we shall see in the next couple of weeks. So that what he does right from the beginning, and I'm thinking simply at this point of the prologue of the first four verses, he lays out the difference between the past and the present. In other words, in the past, then God spoke this way through the prophets in various times in what we would call the Old Testament prophetic period, and the present for him, which is the time in which the Son has appeared. Note that reference. The first time it's used in respect to the Son, whom he doesn't designate any further at this point. This is the now time. We'll see that the now time is not the time of the Son. It's a later era. But it's the time in which the past time of the prophets is over, and the time now is the time that's to be listened to in terms of the Son, whom is the primary focus of Revelation. So immediately you can see that there's a discount of the previous period, which would be the time of the law, the time of Moses and the prophets, and what's to be occurred now is that the time of the Son takes precedence over that. And immediately then, and notice also that at the end of that is that then not only is that the case, but in verse 4, so the author brings in also not just the element of the law, which then would cover all the prophets who were part of the law in terms of the giving of the law and the experience of their prophetic revelations under the law, but also the mediation of that law, which was accomplished through the ministry of angels. So he says he became the Son as much superior to the angels as the name he's inherited is superior to theirs. So he's right at the beginning, he's covering all the bases. He's saying that the Son is superior to the angels and to the law itself. And then he picks up for the rest of the chapter the superiority of the angels, of the Son over the angels. And to do that, then he quotes from the Old Testament, as we call it, to establish that, from the Psalms, Psalm 2, from 2 Samuel, and from the book of Deuteronomy. basically, in doing this in the first chapter, what you need to do is to notice how the author refers to the Son. In other words, does the author refer to the Son in any other terms, or does he refer solely to the Son in respect to the Son? And also, what are the designations that he refers to the Son? In that way, what you can do is work out a characterization of who the Son is. Because if he is characterized as being superior to angels, then if he's superior to angels, then where is his designation? Where is his place above angels and before God? And you can work that out then, and that will give you a basis from which to answer the essay questions in terms of his prominence. And you can see that in respect to the fact that the angels worship him. And notice that he's referred to in the fourth argument that's used there, he's referred to as God, O God, based on Psalm 104 and Psalm 45. And not only that, but he's referred to as being everlasting, and that he's a creator who will roll up the heavens. And the terms that are used there are terms that are used of God himself, and that he will sit at the right hand of God. So he's referred to as being a creator, and at the same time he's sitting with God at his right hand. So there's no designation in respect to an explanation of what it means to put the Son at the right hand of God, explaining how he fits in, so to speak, with God. But the implication is very strong right at the beginning that the Son is superior to the angels, and the characteristics that are used to describe him in that first chapter are very important in designating what his prominence and place is. Now, from then in that's in chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, and the first thing he does is apply that to his audience to say, if that's true, then there's an implication here. And the argument is really from the lesser to the greater, because he's established here that he's established here that the argument is that the lesser the lesser figures in the hierarchy of being first between the angels and the Son is the lesser figure or figures of the angels in respect to gradation of being, and the Son is different in kind, not just in terms of quality. And then he draws by implication then the message of the Son and the message of the angels who mediated the law is also different. And therefore, the implication is that the message that the angels brought, the law, is of lesser quality than the message of the Son. And he applies that in the sense of, if those who listened to the message that was mediated by the angels, if they were responsible for that message, then how much more are you, the recipients of the epistle, responsible for the message that has come via the Son? So you can see how he's sort of leaning on these people there to basically say to them that the responsibility is sort of ratchet up and a couple of notches, if not more, in terms of your responsibility to be accountable to God because the messages come from the Son. And then you notice also that the Son and his message is put in the past tense of the author, so that the author is writing in a generation after the Son. So he's not a disciple of the time of Jesus, but he's writing later on. The message was delivered and it was confirmed by the apostles and so forth through the gifts of the Spirit. So you can see then that the author is looking back himself and saying that he's writing in such a way to ratify that message and impel upon the readers the seriousness of this message. And we're going to start thinking about what is the importance of this. We're going to sort of be looking at, um, uh, well, let's put it this way: we're trying to, if the author is in a telephone box, if I can put it this way, and he's answering a question or talking to someone on the other end of the phone, what is the person on the other end of the phone asking, or why is the person on the phone saying what he's saying? Now, in other words, even though this is an epistle and not sort of a letter in the form of, say, Paul's letters are, or the nature of the 13th chapter of Hebrews, there's a reason that he's writing this. And we have to sort of work out why. Why is he saying that the Son is on an equality with God? Why is he saying that the Son is above the angels? Now we'll deal with this in the next 4 weeks in more detail, but at least I want to bring it to your mind at this point. All right, now after this, now I'm going to move a bit more quickly. Is that what's introduced? And we'll just to give you a quick overview of chapter 2. Then is the idea that the Son, and I've purposely just mentioned the Son because that's all he does until he gets to verse 9 of chapter 2, where he suddenly brings up and introduces Jesus. And the reason he does that is because he's going to, well, I'll ask you at this point, why does he do that? That's important for you to ask that. He doesn't just bring in Jesus as a name for no reason whatsoever. Ask yourself that. Why does he do it? Well, look at the previous verses. Verse 8, he quotes from Psalm 8, and he references there humanity, what is man, etc. And he contrasts humanity with the angels in terms of their ontology, in respect to their being. Humanity is what? Is on the gradation of being lower than the angels. And from that standpoint, then, we've got this gradation so far of we've got the Son, whom is higher than the angels in being from chapter 1. And then we've got humanity, who is lower than the angels. And then suddenly we've got the introduction of Jesus. And he is now introduced as someone who is a human being. Now, the difficulty that the author has got here is if Jesus is a human being, that means that he is introduced as someone who is lower than the angels because he's a human being. But he doesn't want to say that because he's already said in the first chapter that he's higher than the angels as the Son. So there's a reason that he uses the word Jesus in respect to what? Well, I'll leave that for you to work out, but you can see that it's connected with the element of his humanity, because in verse 10, that the author connects Jesus in his humanity with the humanity of the human race, where the quotation from Psalm 22 is that Jesus will then be one with humanity as he calls them his brothers. And this has to do then with the salvation that he's brought by overcoming death, which means overcoming the works of the devil. So now what he's done is, by the end of chapter 2, is he's brought in the element of the Son now being a human figure, whom he calls not the Son, but he calls Jesus. So he's anchored the Son as Jesus on the earth as being a figure who is above the angels. In other words, he's been able to show that the Son as a human figure, which would normally mean that he would be subservient to the angels because humanity is less of a being, or beings, less of a being over the angelic beings themselves. But this figure has proved his worth because he's overcome the problem that humanity has from Psalm 8, which is that all things are subjected to them, but the thing that is not subjected to humanity is death, because death rules over humanity. But the Son has come down as Jesus and has overcome the devil and has overcome death and has brought salvation. So that accentuates his elevation even more, not as the Son per se in terms of his divine nature, as in chapter 1, but as his divine nature encapsulated in terms of his humanity as Jesus in respect to what he's done in bringing about salvation. So he's brought that all together, and then right at the end of chapter 2 there, he's now, because he's anchored Jesus within the structure as a human being in the fold of Judaism. He brings in the point, and this is where you have to do a bit of research. I suggest that you look up on Wikipedia two things. Well, the high priest and the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, and the element of the tabernacle, and the holy place. You need to know what the structure is so that you understand what the high priest did in the Jewish structure of the temple and the tabernacle, so you can understand the interplay of what the author is saying at the end of chapter 2, and this goes into chapter 3 and chapter 4, and it's carried right through the book of Hebrews, in the way that the comparison is made between the high priest and Jesus, who is a representation of the high priest, in a way in which he's the fullest representation of what high priest means. Or I can put it a different way, is that the high priest in the Jewish tabernacle and temple is a shadow of the true representation of what the high priest means, of what Jesus has done. So in doing that then, he's moved then from the what you might call the spiritual or heavenly sphere in chapter 1, and Jesus brought the Son down into the earthly sphere, which is anchored then within the nation of Israel. And in doing that, he's brought Jesus into the Jewish complex of the law and anchored him within the cultist system of being a high priest. So now in three, in chapter 3, he can move into the structure of the Jewish cult and show how Jesus is superior to that cult. And he does that by doing a comparison between here, not the angelic element, but the mediation that was given by the angels to whom? Well, to Moses. Moses was the human mediator between God and the Jewish people. He was given the law, and he constructed then what? The nation, or as it's described here as God's building. And that is again compared to what Jesus, as the Son, has done in respect to creating the new status of God's building, which is, among others, the Hebrew recipients themselves, who are God's building, and all people who respond to Jesus. So there's a comparison that's made. Again, it's the lesser and the greater, because of the analogy that's used where the writer says, look, the Moses was what? As he says, he was a servant in the house, whereas the son is what? Well, he's the son. So you can see the comparison between someone who is hired as opposed to someone who is the heir of the house, and so on. So again, you see the comparison between two elements that are similar but quite different in respect to their comparison from what's lesser and what's greater from that standpoint. And the way that the author does this is by pulling out an element from the um, uh, wilderness wanderings, so that again, what we're seeing here is a drawing out of the pilgrimage notion or the journey of the Israelites into the promised land, and basically saying you are on a journey, and that journey is at a very crucial stage at the moment, because just like the Jewish people were into under the leadership of Moses and were called into the land of Canaan, and many of them didn't make it because they, through unbelief, didn't actually follow Moses. You're in the same position now, and that says something about what the Hebrew readers were doing. In other words, they were. It looks like they were turning away from Jesus, as understood by the Hebrew writer, and were moving into a different form of Christianity that elevated either or both the Old Testament law under Moses, interpreted in some way by an angelic visitation. Now we'll talk a bit more about that later, as it comes out in the next few chapters. But what you can see there is the way that he pulls out a particular a Psalm 95, in respect to a comparison of looking at a particular word, and that word is today. Today, when you hear God's voice, don't be like the Israelites who didn't listen to God. So this was done in Psalm 95, which the author says this is what David said. So it doesn't actually refer to it's a reference that goes back to the Israelites who didn't listen to what Moses said, and many of them perished. And the author is saying, look, David said this later, so what didn't they what is it that was going on there? Well, what was going on there is they didn't enter into God's rest. But because David said this later on, 500 years later on, or 300 years later on, it means then that the rest in the land of Canaan was not the final rest. There is another rest. So that the rest in the land of Canaan was a kind of rest, but not the full rest. And the way that he wants to talk about the final rest, he uses in chapter 4, he uses the rest that God had himself in Genesis 2, verse 2, where God rested when he completed the events of creation itself. And that's a sort of a Sabbath rest. And he's saying that Sabbath rest is still open now. And so the today that David called in Psalm 95, which goes back to the today that the Israelites were called to enter into the land of Canaan, that today is still relevant now and must be followed by you, Hebrew readers, so that you will enter into God's rest, which is the final resting place of achievement that God himself rested on the seventh day, which for you, or what we would call a heaven. It's completion. It's being totally faithful to Jesus, and which you will achieve when you die. So he's then using, once again, he's using an Old Testament example, we could call it here, in terms of the Canaan rest, as a shadow or an example of a more fulfillment of what the what the fulfillment of the what the Son has achieved as a human being, Jesus, in respect to fulfilling the elements of the law in terms of providing salvation through his death, which then calls the recipients to look for not a Sabbath rest or anything that has anything to do with the old covenant, other than seeing the old covenant as a basis from which to get elements which can be seen as shadows or examples or analogies about how to live, but to see a full focus upon following what the Son has done, even in shadows perceived from the old covenant, but to be faithful to the Son now, so that you can enter into the full Sabbath rest in terms of what the Son has achieved by being, and as he introduces this at the end of chapter 4, who is the high priest who has achieved the fullness of forgiveness of sins in the inner sanctuary and therefore given us peace. Now, wow. So finally, then what must you do? Then you must look at the titles that are given this figure, the Son, throughout the first 4 chapters. I would go through and I would note what those titles are, and I would know what is said about those titles in respect to the designation and characteristic that defines what the titles are. I would look about the implications of what those titles are in respect to what the author is saying in terms of their importance for the recipients of the letter. In other words, what does all this mean? What is the author trying to say about this? I would look externally at words that you don't understand or can't fathom their meaning in terms of the argument, like, for example, high priest or holy of holies, then look it up, especially in Wikipedia, and take it from there to help you then fashion the argument in respect to answering the question of the essay. I think I've given you a broad spread of material that will help you to do this, and just follow the directions in the on the syllabus in answering the question. And if you look at the question that I've asked you, the parameters of the question are determined by the specifics of what I've asked in the paper. Okay, thank you.